welcome today. We appreciate everyone being here to be a part of this very important discussion. My name is Erica Smith. I am the Executive Director of Helping Hands of Springfield. Today we are welcoming Elizabeth, Betsy Benito, and John Fallon from the Corporation for Supportive Housing. Betsy and John have graciously come here to help lead our discussion and start a very important conversation that we've all been having for a while, which is how can Springfield develop a community-wide strategy that is long-term and effective to address the issue of homelessness. Betsy is the director of the Illinois program at the Corporation of Supportive Housing, and John is a senior program manager at CSH. Both have years of experience with helping communities around Illinois do exactly what we're hoping to do. So John and Betsy, thank you for being here. We appreciate your coming, and we look forward to working with you much more in the future. So I will turn it over to them. Thank you all.
Well, okay, so I'll get started on some of the Corporation for Supportive Housing slides. So again, as Erica introduced me, my name is Betsy Benito, and I'm the director of our Illinois office for Corporation for Supportive Housing, which I'll just call as CSH. We are really excited to be here. This is not our first time engaging with Springfield. Different team members of mine on and off. We've been down here. Of course, we come down and do advocacy for supportive housing creation in Springfield all the time. And so we're glad that the community is again revisiting how to effectively respond to homelessness and really starting to hone in on housing. So, okay. I'm not sure. I'm still going to figure it out, but it still isn't going to work for me. Okay, it's just slow. Okay, so as I said, we're a national organization. This slide makes us look really fancy, but we're really, we're a nonprofit intermediary organization, which really means that we don't own or operate or directly provide services of supportive housing, but we do focus on supportive housing creation through our lending, which is we function like a bank, so we provide funds to developers and communities who are wanting to use affordable housing connected with services to address a need in their community. So over our lifespan of over 25 years, we've assisted the creation of over 200,000 homes nationally. And as you can see, just the statistics of where our reach has been in working with communities of all sizes throughout nearly the entire country. And we do that through a pretty small staff of about 130 people who work on the ground because we're really leveraging your expertise and your energy. A lot of folks who work for our organization have been mental health providers, supportive housing providers, homeless services agencies, and government staff. And so we are all coming together so that we can really focus on helping your communities address the needs that you see, but using a housing-based solution. Get this right. Okay. All right. Yeah, that would be good. Thank you. It's delayed. Okay, so when we think of, I'm going to talk a bit more about what is supportive housing in case folks in the room are not familiar. But CSH, we focus on all populations, and unfortunately within families and single adults, unaccompanied youth, that there is a need for real proactive support that uses housing connected with services to help people find that pathway back into housing. And so we have a lot of initiatives and strategies around helping end veteran homelessness, helping communities prevent and end youth homelessness, using partnerships with child welfare to address family homelessness through our signature Keeping Families Together initiative. And then where we grew out of and still have a huge focus is around addressing chronic homelessness. So people who are experiencing long-term homelessness in a community that have disabilities in particular, and that may then also be kind of caught cycling back through emergency departments or health systems, jail, things like that, where without attention and without coordination and intentionality, that cycling will continue, but it will end once you're inserting permanent, affordable, supportive housing with ongoing services. Okay, so supportive housing at its core is affordable housing. When we say affordable, the communities, as you may know, of who we're responding to are people who may live on a fixed income. They may have Social Security only. They may be in and out of employment and not in formal employment, so their incomes are extremely low. So in this case, having affordable housing is that we often need some type of support to make the rent affordable for this population in this community. And that around the affordable housing, we provide a whole range of services, but really the core is stability in housing, which makes other services more effective. So delivery of mental health services, access to health care, even achieving employment through that stability of home is really what is wraparound. So the housing is affordable, permanent, and independent. No one has to leave. No one's asked that your time limit is up and you have to relocate to a new unit. It's affordable based on what someone's income is, and someone is living independently. They're managing a lease in the same way that you or I would in an agreement with a landlord. The services are flexible and they're tenant driven. And so it's really based on what is the tenant goals, and how are the services delivered, where my participation in a particular service or program is not a condition of being able to stay in my home, but to make sure that then services are honored so someone is avoiding problems with living in their home and abiding by their lease. So these are the 6 core components around supportive housing. It's really intended for people who have higher service needs that without the assistance will have a difficulty accessing or maintaining housing. So really getting through finding and leasing housing and staying, that it's affordable. There's, I talked about the lease and voluntary services, and it really does involve a lot of coordination. So supportive housing within a community requires that people are working together with a common goal of getting and keeping people housed. Once people are in housing, they really do reintegrate with the community. They may relocate with family. They are volunteering. They are establishing a job. They may go to the local drop-in center, but they're doing activities of their choosing, and with support are re-engaging with their community in ways that homelessness in particular can feel very shameful, feel very isolating and lonely, and housing is a way of kind of helping to reintegrate people and having that connection. You can go to the next slide. I think these are just some good graphics, but also similar to what I've also already discussed. So you can go to the next slide. Do you want to go to the next slide? Okay. Okay, so there's a lot of evidence. I'm not sure how familiar folks in the room are with supportive housing and housing outcomes for addressing homelessness, but they are very high. It's a proven solution that's been around for several decades. You have supportive housing in your community, but you don't have enough. And so most communities are in an ongoing fashion seeking to bring on more affordable housing that's targeted to homelessness, preventing homelessness, but also envisioning ongoing supportive housing needs. These are, it kind of looks like an independent statistic, but this has a lot of backup and can send you links that are on the CSH website to a compilation of research projects that look at stability in housing. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has national standards on where they want communities to hit a benchmark around performance in housing retention. And so this 80% is in alignment with what is expected to be an outcome. Services do change. So if somebody is unsheltered or living ongoing in shelter and using emergency and crisis response services, we see that decline, whereas engagement with more preventative services, stable services, community-based services does increase. And when supportive housing first initiated and may be familiar in your community, is that if you didn't participate in services, you really shouldn't be in this housing program any longer. That concept has parted ways. Probably in 98% of all supportive housing programs across the country And so what we find is that even when services are voluntary, where someone can choose what type of additional service they engage in, that they still stay housed, right? And so that they'll still stay participating when it's up to their choice. So if you're providing a range of things that someone can choose to engage in, when they have that choice, they will continue to engage with the service staff. You can go to the next slide. You can go to the next slide. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time of level setting that Sangamon County and the Heartland Continuum of Care, that there are actually expectations for how you as a community function and respond to homelessness, and that those benchmarks and expectations are set at the national level, and so that communities, suburban, rural, urban, everyone is operating under the same framework. It will look different in each community, but really the expectation is the same. And these standards are really grown out of how communities continue to evolve over time. So you can go to the next slide. In the past, the way communities, if Helping Hands or Mercy Homes had a supportive housing project and they did really well, they were gold star by HUD, renewed funding, ongoing support. Now, the main source of funding, which is the HUD Continuum of Care dollars, looks at how are you operating as a community. So one program could do really well, but if the rest of the providers are all not on the same page and not as a community yielding outcomes that are being sought, you won't look good. It will matter less that one organization is really premier if people are not swimming in the same direction. And so currently, programs, communities, and continuums are seen as whole communities and whole systems. You can go to the next slide. For those of you who do not know, in 2008, the federal government reauthorized the legislation that created continuums of care, which is the core homeless response system in every community. And it really transformed the definition and the call to action. And as you can see here, it's moving away from crisis response. It's for crisis response systems that prevent and rapidly return people to housing. So the emphasis here is that it's all about how do we get people back home. If somebody is threatened with losing their housing, how do we keep them in their home? And if they do fall into homelessness, what are we doing to make sure that they go back to a home as quickly as possible? Other purposes of the HEARTH Act is that you have a continuum of care, and some, at the time, there were kind of loose expectations of what that planning process looked like. That is now in legislation. So there are clear kind of requirements and standards around how communities establish and maintain their coordination. And again, setting their benchmark. This is going to be very hard in most communities that any homeless episode is resolved in 30 days. But I think throwing the gauntlet down there of what the expectation is that we really should not have homelessness in our society. You can go to the next slide. So again, these are the kind of the core measures that communities are evaluated on, of looking at how many new people flow into your community each year. Data is tracked through a homelessness management information system. It is reported to HUD. There is data quality that is reviewed. There is a report that goes to Congress that's a consolidation. So all of the information from Springfield and Sangamon County is being rolled up into that report that goes to Congress. And so it's looking at these things, and we want to see change to become efficient and effective. So there are, in addition to the HUD goals, there is a U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. If folks have heard of it, it's actually a executive appointment to coordinate across all federal agencies. As you know, homelessness is not just a housing issue, it's not just a healthcare issue, it's not just a school issue. And so really what are strategies and resources that federally people can pull together. And so through that, they've set different benchmarks on how do you understand if you're making effective progress on ending homelessness of various types. Yeah. So in the past, I know that Springfield at one point probably had a Plan 10 homelessness. I used to run a Plan 10 homelessness And the idea was that you would get to zero homelessness. And so learning over time of how difficult that is and difficult that is to sustain, it's helped inform like what are the core actions that communities should be taking to really set up a sustainable response system and collaboration. And so across all these populations, I just wanted to highlight that federally the benchmarks are the same. And these benchmarks are really for communities to evaluate themselves. At some point, like Rockford was able to do this, they evaluated themselves against their benchmarks for ending veteran homelessness and was able to apply to the federal government to say, we would like recognition that we have ended veteran homelessness. Here's our data, here's everything we have in place. So the federal government said, yes, congratulations, you have ended veteran homelessness. It's a badge of honor, but it also shows that they've really made systems change in how they respond and are working on ending chronic homelessness. So again, long-term homelessness with a disability. Over time, we know that the success of these strategies can result in additional resources. So there is a reward system for communities who are showing progress, and that is through annual applications for competitive funding. And the federal government has continued to put out new dollars for different strategies that communities should and could apply for. So we're So I wanted just to highlight some things that are unique. So really the commonalities is everybody being identified? Is everybody being engaged and identified? If somebody is in need of a crisis housing or stepping forward for a crisis, are they being offered a solution, bringing them in? We know that oftentimes the way shelter is offered in a variety of communities is you can't stay there if you have been drinking. You can't stay there if you didn't show up by 7. We need to have a more comprehensive solution so that we're able to continue engagement and move people along the process to housing. So around chronic homelessness, a unique feature is really focusing on housing first, and that is really being able to engage and offer housing, permanent supportive or permanent stable housing with services, being able to provide that without precondition. Okay, so the orientation, I'm going to go through that in a little bit more depth in a couple of slides around what is housing first, but it is what it sounds like. Okay, you're thinking about your housing solution first, and people don't have to achieve certain benchmarks to be offered housing. Okay, that's been disproven as a strategy. Okay, so the next slide. Around veterans, I don't know if you can advance the slide. Okay, so kind of a unique feature here is responses to veteran homelessness. So the VA has been really integrating at the local level, and a lot of resources. You may have heard there has been like an ongoing flow of resources around veterans, and the way that they're responding now to homeless veterans is a great model for every other population in terms of what they provide with a sufficient flow of housing support, just like ongoing response and attention, permanent supportive housing, as well as what's called rapid rehousing, which is a transitional rental assistance with services. The reliance previously was on transitional housing, so like site-based transitional two-year housing where people would go and stay. This is now through a iterative process with the VA. It's supposed to be used on a limited basis, and the VA has created a whole range of temporary housing options to offer to veterans who are experiencing homelessness, and really track to make sure that really this is transitional, site-based transitional housing is only being used in limited instances, so that we're not over-relying on that program response. You can go to the next slide. So for families, I really wanted to highlight here around family homelessness, prevention, and diversion. Characteristics of family homelessness can often look different than single adult homelessness, although we know that single adults become homeless and they're actually separated from their families at the time of their homelessness. But here is we want to make sure that children in particular are in a stable living environment. And so the idea of prevention and diversion is that you're able to provide temporary rental assistance and community-based services or housing stabilization services when someone is stepping forward with a housing crisis to keep, really to address children. You can go to the next slide. And for youth, it's very similar. It's very similar to families, but I think just looking at like how quickly we can rehouse folks, really how do we mitigate youth homelessness. There has been a connection demonstrated between children and youth homelessness with ongoing adult homelessness. So I live in Chicago, I work in Chicago. A value of the youth homeless strategy among the homeless youth themselves who have an advisory board, as well as the providers, is that they want to prevent adult homelessness. So really their drive is if a young person, 18 to 25, is experiencing homelessness today, we don't want that to persist into future adult homelessness because a proven connection has been made through data. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to move now into how are we expanding housing options? What are the potential strategy areas? You can go into the next slide. So there's multiple ways to create housing. You can rent already existing housing in the community, and you can continue to build new housing. There's a capital bill that's being promoted, and CSH and the Supportive Housing Providers Association are kind of co-sponsoring that community advocacy. But across the state, you know that there's more affordable housing that is needed. And so at its core, we know that we need to produce the type of housing that our communities need. Is it rental stock? Is it rehabilitating properties that are in disrepair? How are we using that to revitalize our communities? So in particular around supportive housing or around homeless response and housing is that you may have resources that already exist within your community that may be functioning as like outdated models. So if you have a transitional housing program, but people are living there consistently and they fit the profile of someone experiencing chronic homelessness otherwise, and they are experiencing long-term homelessness, when you're in transitional housing, you're still homeless. So the longer you let somebody live in transitional housing, they're retaining that homeless status. So they're still considered homeless, but they will have lost their preference around their chronicity, around their time. It's a bit of a nuance, but it's a big driver as we start to really prioritize and focus on ending chronic homelessness. So you may have resources that you can kind of make changes to that can serve a similar purpose in a similar population, but really focus on the permanency. We know that the Springfield Housing Authority has a number of resources. Housing authorities have the ability to apply for special funding that can be targeted to people experiencing homelessness, and your housing authority has done that and will continue to do that, and then can work in coordination with the community. So there are some things that become available that you need to make sure that are actually being applied for and used and are informed by how the community wants to see them used. And by the community, I mean the continuum or the homeless network. You can build new housing, which I'll get into, and find other ways to generate some revenue or tap into other available resources. So again, kind of referring to the housing authority, they have rental assistance, they have some buildings, but if they don't have a preference and kind of an access point, we know that this group needs a path out of homelessness. And then it's really important that if you are able to access or create a housing project today, that you're not thinking that that's done, right? We do not control all the forces that impact someone losing their housing. It can be through medical, it can be through divorce, it can be through bankruptcy, it could be through a mental health crisis. We don't know what the future holds, but we know that there will be ongoing falling into homelessness over time. And so when you're thinking about long-term community needs, that could be focusing just on homeless housing, or you really want to have affordable housing that you can make accessible to people who have fallen into homelessness or are going to be at risk for homelessness. So long-term housing needs, for us, it's also how are people who are experiencing homelessness or kind of that profile of need and connection with services included in a jurisdiction's or a community's economic development plan. They're forecasting if there's a vision for affordable housing, can some of that be carved out and envisioned to address a vulnerable population? And so we don't often get to those tables from the homeless space. You can go to the next slide. So creating units through development, which is a more challenging, longer term process, but also yields a result that has a very long-term commitment and often a mission commitment to addressing vulnerable populations. So building something from the ground up allows partners to come together and really make sure that the housing itself is focused and meeting the needs of a particular population in terms of who are partners, who are services, and any other sort of features of the property itself. So if it's a family property, are there things that would offer family space? Would it be not just a playground, but are there things for older children or as children grow? Things like that in mind that really has a vision from the front end. Multiple partners have to work together. There's multiple layers of assistance that are needed to integrate into the project, and those things need to be envisioned up front. And those all really focus in on, center around who it's you're identifying that you want to house. We talked about multi-purpose space, and then there is dedicated property management. So any development, so if there's a not in my backyard, if there's concern about what a property is gonna do to a community, there's actually studies that come out of groups like Enterprise Community Partners that there is no economic down effect of having a supportive housing project in your community, that there is a benefit. It is an economic stimulator. You're getting tens of $millions often for each project that get invested and jobs created, and then permanent jobs of staff who work there. CSH, we set standards for quality and supportive housing, and that includes around property management. So to ensure that there's someone who's gonna be on site, taking care of the building. When a building is built, it's an asset. Like your home is your asset and you wanna take care of it. You don't want things to fall into disrepair. That's no different in a supportive housing project than it is in any other physical property. And even more so, because often the property owner or the developer, that's tied to the health of their organization or the health of their company. You can go to the next slide. Okay. You can also create supportive housing by having partnerships with private landlords in the community. And that is done by having some rental assistance that's dedicated either through the Housing Authority or through the Continuum of Care, or through state resources where you're making an agreement with the landlord that he or she will accept the subsidy in terms of receiving payment as in addition to the tenant portion of the payment. We'll go through the inspection processes that are required to make sure that the housing is safe and healthy. And so we have found that there's many landlords who are very welcome and opening of doing that. Sometimes there are local policies that make it more challenging, that put some fear into a landlord if there's a nuisance abatement. And so there's just the fear that there's going to be nuisance to abate. And so would they get in trouble? And so, in particular, being able to look at some of those policies to give some other feedback to or some support to the landlords. Sometimes there's an expectation of would there be damage to the property. Some of these things that can happen, especially if somebody is newly living in housing and it may have been decades since they've had their own home. We know that there are people who may never have had their own home where they were the primary responsibility. And so even with services, just making sure that, that the unit is tended to. And so in some locations that we've worked in, you may have an additional deposit for a landlord. They may want a double security deposit or some sort of emergency fund to address some of those concerns, again, to maintain their asset. Leases, sorry for the incomplete sentence. Leases would be renewed annually, so they're really an annual lease. It's just like you or I having a lease, and that the role of services is to help tenants grow and thrive and meet their personal goals, but also to be on call for that landlord. If somebody is late with their rent, that they have someone to call. If somebody has had a visitor over for more than 3 days, that they have someone to call. If the trash wasn't taken out properly, they have someone to call. So things like that are adjustment processes that really are about core complying with your lease, that it is the point of the service provider to be the one also to help intervene and work with tenants on that. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so back to the housing first concept, just some of these principles, and some have already been recurrent. So people can go directly from street into home, right? So they're not required to stabilize in a shelter for X period of days. If that shelter is only a 12-hour shelter, that shelter only allows you to stay for a certain period of time, it will take 30 plus days to find and sign a lease in a building. If you're going out to look for an apartment, it's not typical that you're just gonna go one day and sign a lease. There might be special circumstances for that, but that there's typically some type of time period so that people can be offered housing immediately. We have been looking for you, you've been experiencing chronic homelessness, your unit is now available, what can we do to get you to move in? So some of these things I've already touched on, but these are just reiterating that these all compile the core principles. One that often gets some pushback is a harm reduction approach. People are not going to always be clean and sober. They're not always going to be compliant with their treatment plan around mental health. I have had a child with some mental health difficulties at times, and medication compliance was a challenge. Motivation was a challenge. Getting her to do things that I want her to do is a challenge. If you have a teenager, you may understand harm reduction if you're trying to continually engage them and keep them on the path where you know so that they're making choices that will not be so destructive for themselves, but can continue them on the path. So I draw on that a lot when I'm thinking about harm reduction through that process. But there is a real strategy. This is a evidence-based practice around addictions and maintaining abstinence, that people will have ups and downs, and that you continue to provide services, and that it doesn't always require rehab, right? If you find someone has relapse, it doesn't mean that they leave their home and have to go into an abstinence-based program, but you're continuing to provide a harm reduction approach to services to engage people on why they're drinking or why they're where they are in their recovery journey. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so you've created your housing. So now you have 30 units that are going to open in a couple of months. What are you going to do next? And so there's a plan for that has emerged, which Springfield does have, and every what's called coordinated entry. You go to the next slide. Every step of this is a challenge. My team for the City of Chicago is the coordinator of our coordinated entry system. You can go to the next slide. So you created the housing. So we know that communities will apply and create new housing, and sometimes we see change in who's getting access, but it might be kind of a confusion. How do I know when to call if they have a vacancy? And people are kind of, especially if you're a vulnerable population or you've been living in a shelter for a long period of time, you're not sure when to call for housing. Or do you go line up, or I don't remember what day it is, and I don't remember when I should go to that waiting list opening and get my name on the list. So what has happened to mitigate all of that process is, again, through the continuum of care, there's a new standard around coordination. It's called coordinated entry, and every continuum needs to have it. So every homeless resource, every housing resource touching homelessness needs and should take their referrals through coordinated entry. And so that is actually something that goes through data, where it goes through assessments. I think assessments have been happening in your community to identify someone's best housing need. So you have housing, the units are becoming vacant. Folks in the overflow shelter or through Helping Hands, for instance, they've all been assessed. We know what all of their housing needs are. The top 3 folks, I'll talk about prioritization in a second. Coordinated entries like, I've got 30 units or open, I need 40 referrals. Can you please send me 40 people through coordinated entry? And so they're actually from your homeless community in order of who you're prioritizing needs housing the most, where this housing is a life-saving intervention. It helps us reduce and end chronic homelessness. They're actually getting referred directly. So the housing provider isn't queuing up who they want to house and whatever by time-stamped order. There's an actual method to how you're getting referrals and who you're housing. And so this is kind of that process. You're assessing folks, you're ongoing engaging, and then when it's matched, they've actually have a housing unit identified, and then someone's helping them navigate that process, and then they complete their lease. So an example of prioritization could be your priority is you want to house people who've been homeless the longest. So you know how long everybody's experienced homelessness, literal, and so that on the street or in a shelter, you may establish a priority for people who are living unsheltered, and down from there. 2 people who've both been experiencing homelessness for over 5 years, 1 stays regularly in a shelter, 1 is having a hard time staying in the shelter or engaging in the shelter, and so they live outside, you may have priority that person is offered housing first, and on down the row. So again, HUD wants every community and requires every community, you need to establish some method of how you're connecting people to housing. And the other standard is that it is to address the highest needs first. So this is a big difference from the past. A lot of this is really also contingent upon what strategies do you have in your community to stay connected to people experiencing homelessness or who are living outside in particular. And CSH has created a toolkit. We kind of like these little toolkits that are guides that have a ton of resources attached to it that help you think through what is your strategy around outreach. Not everybody's going to walk into a service or consistently walk into a service. And so if you know somebody has a need, they may not be able to advocate for themselves on how to request help. They may not want to request help in a way that you can understand how they want. So the skill of outreach workers, it is truly a skill. It does involve consistent outreach and engagement and relationship building to build that trust. So around homelessness, we're working with folks who've been burned by multiple systems. They may have adverse experiences from growing up and in various stages of recovery where they haven't been offered help, right? So if you have someone who's been outside for 10 years and you haven't responded, they may have trouble trusting that you want to meet the need that they've already told you that they have, which is a home. So best practices in outreach is really also looking at that it is based in housing. It is to offer services, but it is to talk about what are people's housing needs and goals. It's relationship based, and it does involve coordination in many communities. And like you have your lovely police homeless outreach team, it's a key feature. You may have community mental health agencies who see people and are doing outreach, and you may have a shelter or other provider, and you may all be interacting with the same person. You are interacting with the same people, and how are you talking about that to get people working on the same goal? And where are folks at with those? So someone may take the lead because they have the strongest relationship or connection or trust, and so when it comes time to move someone into housing, they would be part of that discussion. So I think that outreach feature, especially when we're focusing on moving people experiencing chronic homelessness into housing, is something that is needed to be consistent as a touch point, especially if access to other resources can be difficult or may be varied throughout the community. That to have someone who can provide consistency regardless of where someone is staying physically, that they have that touch point. You can go to the next slide. So this is the website of that. So this is like the end of my presentation, is that housing is not just housing in and of itself, but it is the anchor under which every other activity should be arranged, and that we do need to make sure that there is really intentional coordination, outreach and filling in services that you may not have that help people get in and stay in their housing. But that this change is possible, that there are resources, you're not resource poor, and that you can develop new strategies and really adopt some of these things that have been successful in other communities and in Springfield. So I would be happy to take people's questions or comments. Yes, sir.
The housing issue and everything, what kind of job training or future income is being developed, or as far as job skills go, so people can pay their rents or pay the bills?
Yeah.
Where I see is a lot of housing opportunities, but no instrument of employment or training.
Yep.
And that seems to be the issue.
Yeah, so his question was on employment and how are folks connected into employment after so they can help contribute and pay their rent, and maybe at some point then assume the entire rent and that they no longer need the assistance. And that is a feature of the case management. I think it was on like the earliest slide. The connection to employment is one of those essential services delivered in supportive housing services. So what are your employment goals? Do you want full-time, part-time? we know that there's a number of people who will go through training program after training program. If your community is lucky enough to have a range of job training programs, but are you really achieving that job? The workforce system is not friendly to people experiencing homelessness that have challenges. It wants people who do not need supports that can go from minimal job training into an independent job. And so we know that if it has been a long time, maybe there are new industries or new settings or new expectations in the workforce. Does someone have the right supports, or would they even meet the eligibility? And I don't have those off the top of my head, but we know that there's a big disconnect between the homeless system and the workforce system. So it is a feature and a goal, and supportive housing services help people connect into employment. I hope that answers it. It is important. Yeah, and it's all based in what are someone's goals. Some people who may be on social, like they may have a disability income and they can work some hours but not full-time hours, and so it's all looking at what is somebody's goals. Yeah, but it's not a requirement. If the rent has assistance, employment can fluctuate, and so that ability to have stable rental support is key then to keeping people housed as well. Yes, ma'am.
So how do you get buy-in from the total community? I mean, I know, you told us that there's statistics that show that, affordable housing, economically doesn't disrupt a community, but how do you get that information out to the community so that there's buy-in?
Yeah. And so I'm just going to interpret buy-in means support for a development in a community, or buy-in that like this is worth even doing?
Yes.
Okay, so kind of both. There's one, I think it's telling the good stories, so things that may exist here, or if they don't exist here, that are happening elsewhere in communities that are similar. I would like to kind of ask, how do people feel? Do you feel better because you can see people outside, and so I see them and they're homeless, and you trust that more than trusting that they have a stable place to be at night? I mean, I think it's starting to provide some information and having folks also start to ask the questions, can you believe that housing is successful? And so if you said we have 30 units of supportive housing, 85% of people who live in supportive housing, they came from our overnight shelter, they are now living in housing, and we see them stably housed. Maybe that type of public reporting annually would be really helpful to show that this is actually already working in your community. When it comes to developing community support, I think a lot of local neighborhood residents want to understand, like, who's even going to be managing this in the community? What is it going to look like? Is there going to be outside space? How do you know who is living there, and what type of services are you going to provide? Is there a role for community feedback? Is there a role for tenant feedback? That sort of thing. So a lot of times people want to be a part of the process instead of like this is going up and not feeling like an outlet. It's a challenge. I'm just going to say one more thing. So I do appreciate your question. We have it does feel like there's not one response that would satisfy the answer, right? So I think as humans and as members of communities, we have to really also ask ourselves, what do I want to see answered, and how do I change? What is other hearts and minds changing that happens? Because we've been in multiple instances where all of the statistics and all of the comfort still may not address someone's discomfort. So sometimes it's just not successful even in the best of times, and that there is community opposition. I don't think that's quite answering your question, but John.
I'm John Fallon, also with CSH, and I just want to follow up on that question for Springfield. First of all, I absolutely think it's possible, and it may not be possible with the way services are organized and other things, that you can bring someone directly from the streets into housing. So there have to be systematic changes and ways in which you get the kind of intensive services. I've taken my glasses off, which means I can only see half of you. Okay? I don't need, the idea is not to remove all of my support services and then let me drive. The idea is that I always wear the glasses. So that's what you should know, is that some people are going to need a lot of support to stay in services, not for 90 days, but they may need continuous support in order to stay in housing. It is not a good idea to have me without housing, or without glasses, okay? It will be bad for the community. But what I really wanted to interject was that when you ask how the city of Springfield and the county may make differences, I think it would be good to hear from public officials. And I'm pleased to say, if it's okay with you, Betsy, the mayor is willing to say a few words. He's not, let me just do this right, okay? I'm not setting him up to do anything. He just said he'd say a few words. So there's no promises now. He's entered into an engagement with CSH and an engagement with the community about how to solve this. But he's here, which is more than I can say for most mayors in the state. And he answered a lot of questions, and he's really done some homework. But I'd like a chance at least to make sure while he's here, and I know he's got another meeting soon. Is that okay, Mayor, for you to come up?
Sure.
And we'll go back to your questions afterwards, but I don't want to miss the mayor while he's here.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Betsy, for being here. Didn't she do a great job? And before I forget, I'd like to thank the Heartland Continuum of Care, all their efforts. It's made up of a lot of organizations. And then Erica Smith with Helping Hands. Helping Hands helped with the overflow shelter, partnering with the city, the medical community. So thank you for all your good works. I do feel a little set up because that was a tough question asked by the elected Gail Simpson, Alderwoman Simpson. So she's hopefully be serving us real soon, May 22nd, it's the inauguration. But also Alderman Proctor's here. One that has a lot of influence or connections with the homeless is Officer Jones, and he's our first homeless outreach officer, and we appreciate the police and their support of that. But with regards to the question, that is the challenge for Springfield and Sangamon County, so I'm glad to see Sharman Doring here with Community Services. How do we maximize our resources to provide, it's Abraham Maslow's basic needs. It's food, shelter, and then the employment and everything else comes after that. And so how do you get to that point in one's life? So I really enjoyed the graphic where it outlined the coordinated effort with regards to assessing and moving along the kind of the stair step for that housing initiative, because that's what it's going to have to take, especially with our homeless. You can see right now, the overflow shelter closed for the summer. A lot of times we don't have the resources to keep it open all year, but that's the goal, is how do we move towards that initiative to make sure that we have the supportive services all year round. And it's not taxing on one entity, one individual, because it is a community issue that we all need to work together to resolve. But in talking with Reverend Susan Phillips, I really appreciate her efforts. She's new to the community, which is good because she keeps that outside perspective to challenge us. We had a meeting over at First Presbyterian Church. We appreciate their efforts in this. And really, how do we work together? And talking with her yesterday, I said, well, the overflow shelter's right here at the library. Everybody from the overflow shelter came to the library. How do we move them to have supported housing all year round? And that's our goal. And that's why I really appreciate everybody coming in attendance, because each one of you are part of the solution. And so as a community, all working together to maximize our brain power, our resources, we'll be able to hopefully get to the point where you have the goal of housing within the 30-day goal. And so we appreciate CSH coming today, sharing their insights, and being willing to work with us on this endeavor. So thank you for being part of it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, there and there and there.
There's no doubt in my mind that this works, and we've had programs like this before, but I was talking to somebody who worked in a situation like that, and it disappeared because of the loss of grants. How are we going to fund this is my primary question.
So funding
Which
for...
might not be a question for you.
Well, I can give a general. Funding for supportive housing. typically the rental support, which is really kind of the core, right? Like in the end, someone being able to help pay their rent is what's gonna, the first step of keeping them housed. So the loss of those grants that are so essential is pretty devastating. If a project is performing, it should be renewable. So, I mean, I think, so CSH, we set standards for quality in general in supportive housing, but technical assistance can be needed in terms of our, is the program being operated in a way? So I don't want to blame, your friend in terms of that was why the program, but that is a threat. So for HUD Continuum of Care resources, those are renewed annually. And those are then evaluated during a local process. And is the project delivering what the community has set forward and wants to sustain? If there's some other funding source that made that go away, it would be helpful to know which one that was and kind of why. But
You're saying it's still grants.
So I think it's more of like a contract, right? So a lot of the essential services are contract. The state in the budget crisis eliminated the supportive services line item. So that could have been a reason for the closure. It was the services dollars. It's hard to operate a supportive housing program when you have no money to deliver the services. When the budget stalemate, and David Esposito from the Supportive Housing Providers Association is here, virtually eliminated that. People had to try to extend or do other fundraising to stay alive, and some programs could not. So we need, obviously, everything needs a sustainable budget solution. And so to say it was unfortunate is an understatement. It's not as typical because most programs that are operated are giving some way to evaluate, some way to reapply. And if you're delivering services, that organization needs to make sure that they're working to develop a sustainable plan for their fundraising. State budget cutting and for multiple years is no one can really plan around that. So we did see a loss of programs because of that.
But it's going to have to be community cooperative to get those HUD dollars.
It is. It's community cooperative to get the HUD dollars. So HUD, Continuum can compete every year for new resources, but it's based on how you're performing as a community. Some changes may need to start happening and make sure that you have organizations that want to apply, and then you have to bring some money to the table. So if you're applying for a $100,000 supportive housing grant, you need $25,000 to leverage or to commit to match to it. So kind of thinking of do people have the capacity to generate that type of additional revenue to grow? So, and that is a continuum discussion. That is, how are you at the table to understand and provide support or direction for organizations? Sure.
One thing about housing funding is that there are a lot of safeguards built in to it for the community. It's not like public housing was once funded. They really think a lot about making sure that there's adequate money to maintain the building in the form of reserves. And it's one of the reasons why at first it seems expensive to build, but a lot of that is extra money, so that if there's something like an extended period of time when there's no budget, those buildings themselves sustain and are good buildings within the community and are good assets.
Yeah.
So I've seen a number of agencies fail, particularly in Central Illinois with the budget crisis, was probably hit the hardest of any part of the state, which is unfortunate. But I didn't see any buildings fail. I've only, in my 13 years, I saw one building where I'd have had to sell it, and the number of mistakes that operator made, there was lots of opportunities to help it.
Yeah.
So the buildings themselves are a secure investment for the community, and they can house people who really need those services, and the building will be okay. And the community just needs to make sure that we never let our service funding in Central Illinois deteriorate again for a state swap.
So I just want to address that there are two parts to it. If it's a development, so kind of back to the Alderwoman's point of building a new building in your community, that is going to come, if you're doing it from the ground up, that property would have a 30-year commitment for a purpose of providing deeply affordable housing but it's probably financed so it can serve like a whole range of incomes, right? Like a whole range of affordable incomes, and then having rental assistance will kind of make sure that that rent is even more affordable to people experiencing homelessness. So to what John is talking about, that building and that asset and that purpose, that money's already been invested. And so I think, how did that housing program close? It really is dependent upon which piece of the three-legged stool around supportive housing, the services, capital, or operating, fell out, and how did it collapse? So we need sustainable resources for all of them. There are, kind of back to that plus minus of a leasing strategy versus a building strategy, is getting at like the longevity and that kind of what's been stably built in. There's a question here.
Okay, I was wondering about this system. If you've done any research on this, or if it's been done. I know I lived up in McLean County.
Okay.
When we had women who needed prenatal care and medical care through their pregnancy and their delivery, what all the OBGYNs in McLean County did is they all made an agreement, and that it was on a rotating basis, that they would provide those services at no cost to the woman, but everybody absorbed somebody. So like I could go to my OBGYN and I would have no idea the person sitting next to me was someone that was basically receiving pro bono services. So would it be possible, rather than trying to build a unit, to work with the Chamber of Commerce, the realtors, and the renters in the community and get everyone to agree, you've got 1,000 units, can you dedicate one? And then training volunteer mentors to support the one individual. That way that person isn't being re-traumatized by hearing all, the stories of who got raped and who got beaten up and ambulances coming and going. They're you don't know. They're integrated into the community. There's someone that it's no cost. That I'm sure there could be some kind of tax write-off or something. But that way you're not talking about building a whole new structure. People won't be traumatized by living next door to somebody that, they would be with people who are in the rhythm of life, who get up at a certain time, make their coffee, go to work, and they can look around and be like, oh, this is kind of a nice rhythm, instead of taking a whole group of people that aren't in that rhythm and putting them together, and then they get they're traumatized, then they get more trauma, and then it's just like trying to get them out. Can you do something like that?
So you're pointing out a great point around kind of what is the setting and what are we driving to create. And so when I was referencing leasing, it's really that. You're really in the community. You might have 2 units in a building. You might have 1 unit in a building. If it's a much larger building, you may have a small handful of units. So it is really relying on that partnership to get people into the community. It's faster, it's less expensive, and people are more integrated. It's a little bit more seamless, and it avoids community opposition. So oftentimes communities, because you're trying to get a housing response going, can't wait 3 to 5 years for a building to be built, and so you're really starting with how are we engaging and moving people into the community. Excuse me. So the idea of, if you can work with the Chamber of Commerce to and others to make these units available, I think it was Nashville. There was a community in some of the work we had done previously, and just watching how they did what they did to try to increase access to housing. And so you can explore a range of creative strategies. I think the one caveat is to ensure, will that unit be available for longer than a year? Like, how long could the landlord really afford to discount rent? Things like that still become part of the agreement to make sure it's sustainable, so that after a period of time, if someone still needs that assistance, because they may only be working minimum wage or something like that, that's just my assumption and experience, but that they can still stay so that there's not more moving. So those are just some of the pieces to consider, but it's absolutely something to discuss of how you would do that. John? And then
I just wanted to push back a little bit on the concern of trauma in this kind of housing. This is their home. It's different than transitional housing, where you're right, everyone's going through a struggle, everyone's worried about going on to the next step, or in a shelter where it's emergency housing. This is their home. So I work with some of the most difficult people coming out of Cook County Jail with severe and persistent mental illness. They did have concerns about how they were a year before, but after a year, they didn't want to talk about it, need to talk about it, and they were going in the flow of life. So permanent supportive housing very quickly over time becomes the flow of life that people can be a part of. Much different than program housing. This is their house. They're moving in, they're not having to worry about moving, they're there, they settle in, they get to meet their long-term neighbors, and we would like to make sure that all of our buildings are integrated, meaning that there's all different kinds of people next door. The problem is when you have an entirely full shelter, trying to get to scale is hard for the community to get 1 unit out of 1,000 when there's a limited number of units. And it's not sustainable, and you're already, as a taxpayer, paying for a certain number of units. The question is who gets in it, and how do we choose who gets in it? And it would be best to put those people with the highest needs who need that resource the most, which is something about coordinated access. Can we make sure that the most needed resources are going to the people with the highest needs so that we get the most bang for our buck in terms of cost savings, in terms of improvement of quality of life, in terms of using a limited valuable resource. This probably is the group of people who we need to prioritize. So Betsy showed a variety of different ways. It could be one building, it can be all scattered site. Any one of those is okay. When you build, a lot of times you want to go ahead and build it with enough units to make it worth the 5-year investment to try to collect together all that funding. So.
I'd like to address the question of cost, because in the research that I've done, the reading that I've done about housing first models, which we heard from the Wichita Police Department when Springfield PD brought them in, from the Chicago hospitals that are addressing homelessness as a public health issue, and from the communities that initially targeted veterans and trying to eliminate that and others, we spend tremendous amounts of money allowing people to remain unhoused. It costs communities less money to house folks than to leave them unhoused. So if we can reduce the number of emergency department visits people make, we can afford tremendous amount of rent money. If we aren't spending money, I pastor the church across the street, our staff, we spend money paying our staff to clean up after folks who are sleeping outside and trying to serve them, when a lot of the reasons that they're struggling, if they were housed, those struggles would go away. So the question is not only how do we channel the funds, but whether or not we have the will to do it. And I think that gets to the question of community and what kind of community we want to live in. Do we want to live in a community that spends our resources wisely in the most humane and compassionate way, or do we want to live in a community where we ignore one another's needs and waste resources? Those are sort of the extremes of our options.
Very good.
Are there any other comments?
Is the PowerPoint available? It will be available. We will send that out immediately. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a landlord at 9 days. I just kind of started looking into this. I started fostering about 1.5 years ago, and then finally decided to buy a place so I could rent it to my foster daughter's mother. And I've been working in statewide education policy for years and years, and more I start thinking, like, if we could really just talk about integration and housing policies, we wouldn't have so much issues on the education side of things. So just brand new to this, I wonder if you can tell me something about kind of the scope of how widespread this problem is, what the division is between the buildings versus going with private landlords, how Section 8 fits into this. Could you just do a real quick 101 on that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, there's a number of really great points. So, yeah, I mean, I think I want to, I don't know if I understand also some of your question around integration. I don't know if you're talking about like racial integration.
I think there was an Illinois Times article like a couple months ago that talked about how Springfield is like one of the most segregated places that, ever, and that a lot of it is due to like zoning and, certain places you can't have multifamily housing and that sort of thing, so.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of those, as we're familiar, around legacy of racism and different ways that then policies are used to control, social control and prohibit integration. And then we see that in the homeless experience. I think it's worth looking at your statistics in Springfield, but this is a national, there's been a lot of more national view on this. So it's something that, is unfortunate. It's very disparate in terms of who is impacted by homelessness. And then also the challenges of kind of relocating or building housing to address the needs. So those ongoing, like zoning and other things have been used to kind of reinforce segregation. So, and code for Section 8, code for multifamily, anything that's code for not allowing integration of housing. So I think your point around the role of, okay, so you had two questions. One is how much is built versus how much is scattered site. So the majority is delivered on a scattered site leasing basis. It's just faster, easier. HUD allows, usually if you're applying for a new grant or a new contract, it's gonna come in the next year and then you have to get it up into operation. So there's kind of some logistical pieces around that. So like in the community where I live, which is Chicago, probably 70% of the units are through scattered site leasing. Just over time, the growth, because of the time and of the resources and the political will around building, it has been that growth. And your community keeps a housing inventory of your resources, so you can pretty easily get that data on what's actually a building versus what are your options as a landlord. And there are other programs that you can use. So housing authorities play a really vital role. Not all housing authority resources are used to address homelessness. And then they have multiple programs. So I don't know if Melissa is still here from the housing authority. She may have left, but like getting in to be a partner with the housing authority is one way. And they are usually cultivating landlords. I think she was kind of talking about all the efforts they do to outreach, to have quality, to have landlords who are delivering quality housing. And oftentimes then in a new building that's built from the ground up, needing a stable rental assistance that can be guaranteed for multiple years is allocated through a housing authority. So I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question or if you're looking as a landlord. Yeah, what is Section 8? Yeah. So it's now called Housing Choice Vouchers. I think that a lot of the emphasis is around choice, again, around mobility, that it is a tenant-based assistance for someone who's eligible and in need of housing authority resources where they need rental assistance, essentially, and to gain access, and then they're choosing what unit they would like to live in. So they're the tenant who's been allocated a rental assistance is going to approach a landlord to say, do you have a vacancy? Will you accept my rental assistance voucher and do the paperwork that's associated with it and get an inspection and then enter into an agreement with the landlord?
Because it's completely separate from your program that you're talking about.
So supportive housing can use housing choice vouchers if there's a services component attached to it. So that can be one way that supportive housing is delivered is through a housing choice voucher scenario. Go ahead. Yes. Go ahead.
I don't really like the idea of a separate building because the other thing it does is it puts a strain on that particular community. So all of a sudden, as a particular, most people choose their residence. I know we did based on which schools we wanted our children to be in. Mm-hmm. But if someone builds a building and that's the only way I can get out of homelessness, then all the children in that building are going to be going to one school or, the schools in that area. Mm-hmm. And I think we're still under a segregation order. So we're under an existing order.
Probably the size of a building, if there's like 30 children, is not going to over segregate, so I think it's just kind of to keep in mind of like, what is the scale? And also if a building is being built in a community that isn't of an opportunity, and so it's a positive to have children who will otherwise not be able to get an advantage and they're homeless to be in a better school district. So I think, again, kind of back to that point around access, we are in an age where we're like decoding all of those reasons as to why we would or wouldn't do something. And so already in a lot of communities, there's a lot of mobility anyway of like, what is your school choice? How do we promote school choice? Evidence that children who are integrated across income lines, like how do we even reduce poverty if education is a path out of poverty, and have school quality? So, size of buildings when they're being built for families. I'm on the board of an affordable housing developer, and I think the family building that they just opened is 33 units total. They're adding, and there are then new kids who, they may be going to a different school, they may not be going to a different school, but that's providing a stabilization, because homeless kids then are changing multiple schools, their education is getting disrupted. So again, I think like the eye on the prize is like, we're providing stability to kids, we're providing a path to kids and ending that homelessness. So we've been a part of providing lending to a project that that was denied, and then sued their local government for prohibiting them to build, because that site had already been zoned for an apartment building, and then like the economy hit, and so that particular condo development, or that development, multifamily development, didn't move forward, and so the supportive housing development went in. And then the city council tried to change the zoning, so they couldn't do that, and that ended in a lawsuit where then the development was able to proceed. So I think we just really have to look if something is zoned, and you could fit another affordable, we're making those discrepancies of who can live where, those barriers are coming down, but then how is the community wrapping around that? So there are pros and cons of like scattered site, more choice, and then development, especially as we're wanting to see more integration, where that can happen to integration of incomes and racial integration, that we can see that become a benefit. So I think we're seeing a new change. We just want to make sure that we promote there just being a range of options available in a community, because some people may thrive better in a single site or in a building that's newly built that has like on-site property management or on-site services, and some people would much rather prefer to live in their own unit in an apartment. And so the push is to have choice and to have options so that you can be effective and really have multiple tools in your toolkit. My personal view and experience is that we are built on where are we searching for an opportunity. However, people who are experiencing homelessness, long-term homelessness, it is not a mobile group. People may be transitioned from, say, Elgin to Chicago, because Elgin has no inpatient substance use, right? So someone who is homeless in their community was transitioned to Chicago because there's a substance use facility. So there may be times where those types of changes occur because someone responding to a crisis is looking, where can I get a service for this person? So I guess the answer is no. If there's limited housing authority resources, but we know the state of Iowa has a lot, you will see attrition from varying places of people, where can I get affordable housing? That's period. I don't think we have a lived experience commission, but people who are experiencing homelessness are not monitoring our performance. And I don't know that the word of mouth is such that if I go there, I can get X. So I think that's quite small. And every community tracks their data because they ask, where were you last living? Where did you come from? And there may be some tracking of like, I came from out of town, or I came from a different location versus someplace. So I think that the short answer is no, we're not seeing that shift because of success or performance. And another reason why, when we're all going in the same direction, when we're all striving for the same benchmarks, that we will be meeting the need that's in our community, and then we won't feel some of those tensions about change.